If TV shows had rankings, this show would definitely be in the top 3. This is Better Call Saul, a show that has maintained high ratings for 5 seasons. It is also the prequel to Breaking Bad, which holds the title of the highest-rated TV show in history. The tightly woven plot of both series not only leaves viewers in awe but also deeply ingrains each character in our hearts. A friendly reminder, don't watch it in the bathroom, as you might end up with numb legs from sitting too long. Following on from the previous episode, Mike wakes up from his coma to find himself in the high slopes of Mexico. Mike enters a house and asks the cooking lady for the exact address. However, she responds in fluent Spanish, indicating she doesn't understand Mike's question. Mike tries to make a phone call, and the woman seems to understand a bit, saying the phone can only make local calls and reminding him not to move too much, or his wounds will reopen. Mike asks if Gus brought him here, but the woman seems unaware of who Gus is. Seeing that his inquiries are fruitless, Mike decides to leave on foot. He walks for half a day without getting far. When he sits down to make a call, he finds his phone has run out of battery. Disappointed, he puts the phone back in his pocket. Mike wonders why Gus is always lurking in the shadows, watching him. At this moment, Mike found an old car coming in his direction. The person who gets out of the car is Gus's doctor, Barry. Mike met Barry when he first collaborated with Gus, and Barry's arrival confirms Mike's suspicions. Barry complains that all the effort he put into bandaging Mike's wounds was wasted. Mike wants to understand why Gus saved him, but Barry says Gus only instructed him to keep Mike alive and urges Mike to come back with him. After a moment's hesitation, Mike agrees to Barry's request. After returning, Barry retreated Mike's wounds. Mike notices the medical equipment here is very comprehensive and guesses that Gus funded it all. Mike believes that this house is where Gus is hiding his contraband, but Barry says there's nothing like that here, only his prescriptions, and that the people here don't have weapons. Mike wants to leave, and Barry doesn't stop him. Instead, he tells him the exact route to Albuquerque. Barry still suggests Mike rest here and recover before leaving. Stubbornly, Mike ignores Barry's advice. As soon as Barry leaves, Mike grabs his coat and prepares to leave again. However, just as Mike walks out of the village, a group of kids coming home from school runs by, and a girl accidentally bumps into him, dropping her bag. Mike carefully picks up the bag. Seeing the innocent smiles of the children changed Mike's impression of the place, so he followed Barry's advice and stayed here to recuperate. As Mike's figure fades away, the camera slowly pans to a water feature with the inscription dedicated to Max. Anyone who has watched Breaking Bad knows that Max was Gus's beloved, who was killed by Hector. This place was also funded by Gus in memory of Max. After returning, Mike attempts to call Gus, but the international call doesn't go through. Mike then starts to prepare a homemade charger to use his phone. The woman sees what Mike is trying to do and helps him find a phone charger. Seeing this, Mike's attitude finally changes, and he thanks the stranger in Spanish. He successfully gets in touch with Gus.
Hello.
You know who this is?
How are you feeling? Better, I trust.
You don't do anything without a reason. Why am I here?
Now is not a good time.
Mike was a little angry when he heard Gus hang up on him. Meanwhile, Gus is not idle, as Lalo has arranged for Crazy 8 to report Gus's stash house to the DEA. However, what Lalo didn't expect was that Nacho had already been turned by Gus. To protect Nacho, his informant, Gus has to play along and intentionally allows the DEA to discover his operation. Despite Hank's efforts to surround and intercept, the criminals abandoned their vehicle and fled, leaving Hank's team with only a few $100,000 in cash. This was exactly Gus's plan. Losing some money is acceptable, but they couldn't take his man. Upon hearing of the plan's success, the cautious Gus immediately destroys the phone. A few days later, when Mike had almost recovered, his mood gradually calmed down. Gus came here to meet with Mike. Mike knows that Gus wants him to become his enforcer, but ever since the basement construction was halted due to Lalo's arrival, along with Werner's death, Mike felt that he and Gus were no longer on the same path. Mike feels Gus is somewhat hypocritical, funding this village to atone for his sins, but Gus said that the people of the village didn't know he was funding it and that it existed only to honor the memory of one man. That person is his tragically deceased boyfriend, Max. Gus confessed that Mike was currently at a crossroads in his life. On one side, he faced his family's lack of understanding, leading him to drink heavily and get into fights with thugs. The outcome of this path was predictable. On the other hand, he offers Mike the option to fight for him, as he needs a warrior like Mike. However, Mike feels that helping one criminal kill another goes against his principles. Gus reminds Mike of the nature of the Salamanca family, implying they deserve their fate. Mike asks why Gus specifically chose him. Gus gives a shocking answer. Mike would understand his vengeance plan because Mike once avenged his son. It seems Gus has thoroughly investigated Mike's background. Because of his deep empathy for revenge and various other reasons, Mike chose to continue working with Gus. A few days later, Nacho, having obtained new intelligence, arranges a meeting with Gus. This time, Nacho brings explosive news. Lalo plans to gradually take over Gus's business until the bosses in the South see Gus as worthless. Gus quickly makes emergency arrangements with his men, then gives Mike a knowing look. Mike understands the signal. It's time to deal with Lalo. Gus instructs Nacho to report directly to Mike from now on and to follow all of Mike's instructions. From this point on, Mike becomes Nacho's immediate superior. After Gus and his team leave, Nacho runs after Mike to warn him about Gus's ruthlessness. Since Mike and Nacho have known each other for a while, they understand one another quite well. Nacho reveals Gus's despicable tactics, but this doesn't surprise Mike, as he's fully aware of Gus's nature. Mike had warned Nacho long ago that once he chose to get involved, there would be no way out. However, Nacho insists that his father is innocent and that he works for Gus solely to ensure his father's safety. Hearing this, Mike feels helpless but says their immediate priority is to eliminate Lalo, and then they can discuss other conditions. What follows is the showdown between Mike and Lalo, one of the most thrilling parts of this season. Mike pretends to be a customer at the bookstore, but in reality, he is there to find a witness to a murder. After confirming that Lillian is the person he's looking for, Mike pretends to be a private investigator hired by the family of the deceased. Mike gains Lillian's trust by saying he is helping the family find the killer, and then asks her about the scene of the crime. Lillian says she has already told the police everything she knows, but Mike knows the information she provided won't help them find the killer. To push the case forward, the retired cop Mike shows her a photo of the killer Lalo's car and asks if she saw this car at the scene. Lillian tries to remember and confirms that the car was there at the time. Worried that Lillian might not know the name of the car, Mike intentionally gives her a hint, hoping she will provide this clue to the police investigating the case. Lillian says she doesn't know the detective's phone number, but the meticulous Mike is already prepared. It seems Mike came well prepared, and his real goal is to get Lalo of the Salamanca family arrested, so Gus's business remains unaffected. Next, Mike sneaks into the police station, intentionally placing a file under the desk and scolding a young employee for not putting it away properly, telling him to quickly hand it to Detective Tim, who was in charge of the murder case. The file is about the hit-and-run incident when Lalo was tailing Mike. Coincidentally, this car matches the one the woman mentioned, and the time and location align perfectly. The police then focus on Lalo's car to speed up Lalo's arrest. Mike receives intelligence from Nacho about Lalo's location. Mike then enters the police radio channel and reports Lalo's position. At this moment, Lalo has no idea he has fallen into Mike's trap. Seeing the police car approaching from behind, Lalo instinctively reaches for his gun, but soon realizes two more police cars are blocking him from the front, with another police car coming from behind. It seems Lalo has no way to escape. Lalo drops his gun, turns off the engine, and throws the keys out of the car. Meanwhile, Kim, in an effort to help Everett, colludes with Jimmy to deceive her banking client. Jimmy, as Everett's defense attorney, works with Kim to make Kevin look bad. However, Jimmy doesn't believe this is the right thing to do. He's only cooperating with Kim and advises her to stop. But Kim is already on a roll and wants to see the battle through to the end. Jimmy assists Kim by hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on Kevin, although Jimmy feels he hasn't found any important clues. The clever Kim notices a photo of a cowboy on a horse, and suddenly an idea forms in her mind. The logo for Mesa Verde Bank comes from this photo, but the photographer is someone else. The next day, Jimmy brings in his old partner to help realize his idea. With time running out, Jimmy wants the work done by tomorrow, but camera guy says it's impossible because Jimmy's requirements are too complex. However, Jimmy is resourceful and always finds a way. Jimmy quickly thinks of using a green screen to shoot, which can be done in one location. So, Jimmy gathers some temporary actors and starts filming at a nail salon overnight. But just as Jimmy is about to finish shooting, Kim rushes in. She says the mission is aborted because her boss, Rick, has seen through their ruse. Although he didn't say anything directly, it was clear he knew. However, Jimmy feels it's a shame because he believes the plan is flawless and has already put in a lot of effort. But since Kim insists, Jimmy reluctantly agrees. What Kim didn't expect was that during the negotiations, Jimmy suddenly demands $4 million in compensation for Everett to relocate. He continues with Kim's plan, thinking that this way, no one would suspect Kim while also securing greater benefits for Everett. This was also Kim's original intention in doing this. Although the plan worked and Kevin compromised, Jimmy wanted to invite Kim to celebrate the victory. But what Jimmy doesn't know is that Kim is already angry with him for acting unilaterally. She feels Jimmy has tricked her. Although Kim wants to help Everett, she also doesn't want her client to suffer such a big loss. Jimmy doesn't truly understand Kim's intention and instead follows his own logic, thinking he protected Kim. Seeing Kim very angry, Jimmy quickly apologizes and promises never to do it again. But at this point, Kim no longer believes him, and they start a big argument.
I don't believe you. You lie. I lie. This has to end. I cannot keep living like this.
No.
Jimmy, shut up. Jimmy. You know this has to change. If you don't see it, I don't know what to say because we are at a breaking point.
God.
Either we end this now, and enjoy the time we had and go our separate ways, or we're...
What?
Or maybe we get married.
This twist came unexpectedly. Kim decides to marry Jimmy because she loves him and doesn't want to leave him. After getting married, they no longer keep secrets from each other, with Huel as their witness. They have a simple wedding in the courthouse. Afterward, they immediately dive back into work. Jimmy receives a call from Nacho, stating that a client needs his defense. This client is none other than the newly arrested Lalo. Facing strong evidence, even having a lawyer present is useless, and the judge decides to deny bail. Jimmy knows it's impossible to win this case, but he must act as if he's taking it very seriously. He suggests Lalo take the plea deal offered by the DA, but Lalo firmly refuses. He wants Jimmy to find a way to get him out on bail. Lalo hints to Jimmy that if he aligns himself with their group, he will have limitless wealth. This episode also echoes Breaking Bad when Saul is kidnapped by Walter and Jesse, who he thinks are sent by Lalo. This time, Jimmy doesn't keep it from Kim. He confesses to her that he is defending Lalo. Kim feels very relieved by Jimmy's honesty and hopes he will continue to be open with her. Then they start celebrating their newlywed happiness. They thought everything would be fine once they got Lalo in jail, but they didn't expect him to get his hands on a phone while inside. Lalo contacted Nacho and gave him a task. Nacho then passed this information on to Mike. The task Nacho received was to find a way to burn down one of Gus's chicken restaurants. Upon hearing this, Mike immediately reported the news to Gus. At that moment, Gus was attending a major meeting at Madrigal, led by Peter, the head of the company's food division. Gus brought his new dipping sauce to the meeting. On the surface, they are business partners, but secretly, they are building a vast contraband empire. Gus's secret construction of an underground factory was for this purpose. They plan to use Madrigal's logistics to transport contraband worldwide. This ties in with the events in Breaking Bad, where after Gus's downfall, the DEA followed the leads to Madrigal, and Peter, knowing he was doomed, committed suicide in the bathroom. Peter thought that once Lalo was in jail, Gus's underground project could resume. However, Gus explained that Lalo was still causing trouble even in prison, ordering his men to burn down one of Gus's chicken restaurants. Overhearing this, Lydia suggests that Gus find a way for Lalo to die in prison. This aligns with her malicious character in Breaking Bad. However, Lydia's idea was too simplistic. Gus explains that if anything happens to a member of the Salamanca family in the north, the Mexican cartel will blame him, leading to unimaginable consequences. So Gus decides to change tactics and find a way to send Lalo back to Mexico so he can continue his project in peace. Gus then arranged for Mike to contact Lalo's lawyer, Jimmy, and have Jimmy find a way to bail Lalo out, providing Jimmy with some information. Although Jimmy was reluctant, he couldn't afford to offend these people and had no choice but to comply. To cooperate with Lalo's orders to Nacho, Gus was even willing to burn down his own restaurant. Nacho arrived at the chicken restaurant, recklessly destroying everything inside. As if venting his frustration towards Gus, Gus arrived at the restaurant and turned on the gas, then picked up a fresh frozen chicken, heated the frying oil to a boil, and created a little slide for the chicken. As the tray's temperature rose, the thawed chicken began to slide down slowly. Just as Gus stepped outside, the spark from the fryer instantly ignited the entire restaurant. It must be said, Gus was willing to do anything to achieve his goals. The next day, Jimmy brought new evidence to appeal for Lalo. and he even brought a few people pretending to be Lalo's family members. Jimmy reminded Lalo to act a bit timid later on, as this might help his chances of getting bail. However, fear was never a part of Lalo's life creed. Seeing the victim's family, Jimmy felt a pang of conscience, but he knew the consequences of not defending Lalo outweighed his professional ethics. Jimmy argued that the librarian's testimony was coerced, something the police could verify, as Lillian was indeed guided by Mike. Of course, Mike had used a fake name. After Jimmy's elaborate arguments, the opposing lawyer requested a private discussion to give Jimmy an out. The judge agreed to grant Lalo bail, but the bail amount was set at a staggering $7 million, cash only. Hearing this, Jimmy couldn't stay calm. It was clear they didn't want to release Lalo, but to Jimmy's shock, Lalo said he could pay the bail, but needed Jimmy to fetch the money for him. After the hearing, Jimmy secretly observed the victim's family. His conscience once again pricked. The shiny wall reflected Jimmy's contorted face, symbolizing his conflicted emotions at that moment. Just then, Howard suddenly approached Jimmy, pretending to ask how Jimmy was considering the job offer he had given him. Jimmy had almost forgotten about it and said he was still considering, but Howard insisted he shouldn't consider it. Howard had discovered that Jimmy had been messing with him. Jimmy played dumb, saying Howard was acting strange. From Howard's perspective, he thought Jimmy had a psychological problem and expressed sympathy for Jimmy's situation. Hearing this, Jimmy couldn't contain his anger.
You kill my brother, and you say you're sorry? Big job at the illustrious HHM. Chance to play at the palace. Little old me? You have no idea what's going on. You're a teensy tiny man in a teensy weensy little bubble.
No, Jimmy.
Oh, don't you Jimmy me.
Seeing Jimmy's irrational behavior, Howard turned to leave, but Jimmy, already in a foul mood, unleashed his frustration on Howard. He felt that someone born into wealth like Howard could never understand what he had been through. Jimmy's grotesque and twisted outburst reminded one of Chuck's awkward court incident. After Howard left, Jimmy met with Lalo again. Lalo gave Jimmy the exact address to retrieve the $7 million, noting that the contacts were Lalo's cousins. Jimmy suggested having them bring the money directly, but Lalo disagreed, insisting the whole thing needed to be handled very discreetly. If those two guys showed up, their rivals would find out. Jimmy recommended Nacho, but Lalo didn't trust Nacho. He was worried that Nacho might run off with the $7 million. However, Jimmy was a small-time player who wouldn't dare to do such a thing. Jimmy was the perfect choice. Seeing that he couldn't refuse, Jimmy reluctantly asked for $100,000 for the errand, considering this was less than 2% of the $7 million. Lalo thought for a moment and agreed to Jimmy's terms. Back home, Jimmy didn't hide this from Kim. When Kim hears that he's supposed to pick up $7 million for a thug, she tries her hardest to stop him, regardless of how high the commission is. However, under Jimmy's persuasion, Kim had no choice but to agree. Early the next morning, Jimmy quickly found the location Lalo had specified. Before the contact arrived, Jimmy checked his appearance, knowing that the people he was about to meet were no ordinary individuals. This scene was reminiscent of one in Breaking Bad, where, seeing a bit of dust on his shoes, Jimmy extravagantly used bottled water to clean them. Little did he know that this action would come to haunt him. Soon, the cousins arrived, confirming that Jimmy was the lawyer sent by Lalo. They handed him 2 large bags of cash without a word. Seeing that he was about to easily earn a commission of $100,000, Jimmy hummed a tune all the way back, but his joy was premature. He hadn't gone far before an SUV started tailing him. Jimmy waved, signaling for them to overtake. Completely unaware of the impending danger,